Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 23rd episode of 2026. In Washington, 54 of 56 states and territories have submitted their final BEAD proposals to NTIA, and 52 of those states and territories have NTIA and NIST approvals, making their BEAD funding available for broadband deployment. Unfortunately, NTIA's effort to squeeze providers down on their awards to the benefit of the bargain round and subsequent renegotiations during the curing process has resulted in a significant number of sub-grantees walking away from their BEAD awards. In Texas, for example, awarded funds were reduced by $203 million. As a result, 4 grant winners in Texas walked away from 31,000 awarded locations, which is about 13% of Texas' total BEAD locations. Our good friend Carol Maddy wrote in a blog that some states could see a drop-off in BEAD participation of 10% or more, with some states potentially reaching up to 50%. The good news from Carol's perspective is that these BEAD walkaways are technically not defaults, and that the BEAD or the NTI BEAD guidance allows states to go to the next bidder in line to negotiate and make some adjustments on these awards. So there's an opportunity for the states to find agreements that can work with providers to be able to get this done. And we'll keep an eye on this, as states only have 6 months from the signing their agreements with NIST to execute contractual agreements with their BEAD subgrantees. The Fiber Broadband Association's next regional Fiber Connect workshop will be held in Bozeman, Montana on Tuesday, July 21st. Registration for Bozeman is well ahead of pace, and so please register ASAP, because this will be our biggest event to date. After Bozeman, we'll be in Omaha in August, Boston in September, Savannah in October, and Vancouver, British Columbia in November. And then we'll finish out our year with our premier member meeting in Islamorada in Florida in December. We hope that you'll join us for our annual Fiber Day on the Hill and DC Fly-In. That will be in July 15th and 16th. So a lot going on for the rest of the year. So hopefully you'll be able to join us in many of these events. Last week on Fiber Breakfast, our guest was Jeff Hainan, the Vice President of Broadband Access and Networking at Deloro Group, to discuss his latest broadband access and home networking forecast. The key takeaway from Jeff is that AI is beginning to take off, and low latency and upstream capacity will be paramount for networks going forward. So if you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Ron Westfall, the Vice President and Practice Leader of Infrastructure Networking at HyperFRAME Research, to discuss his latest research lens, the state of infrastructure and operations, the second half 2026 report. Ron is a prominent analyst figure in technology and business transformation, recognized as a top 20 analyst by AR Insights and a Tech Target contributor. His insights are featured in major media such as CNBC, Schwab Network, and NMG Media. His expertise covers transformative fields such as hybrid cloud, AI networking, security infrastructure, edge cloud computing, wireline, wireless connectivity, and 5G IoT. A lot of stuff, Ron, you got on your plate. So Ron bridges the gap between C-suite strategic goals and practical needs of end users and partners, driving technology and ROI for leading organizations. With leadership roles at Futurum Group, Global Data and Current Analysis, he has spearheaded ecosystem-wide research initiatives and managed content creation and productions with significant revenue goals. So welcome, Ron. And for audience, please type in your questions as we go, and we'll work those in discussion. With that, I will hand things off to Ron.
Well, thank you, Gary. Yes, I think I will definitely leverage that very helpful introduction and look to streamline the conversation as I proceed. And before I dive right in, I just want to say that the Fiber Connect event in Orlando this year was outstanding. I think we had very valuable conversations, very helpful insights and takeaways, and I've actually incorporated them into the conversation here. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking about our latest research, which focuses specifically on I&O, infrastructure and operations, And okay, why does this matter in the AI era? And certainly, why does it matter to the fiber community? And to dive in, I'm going to give an overview of the survey itself. Basically, we reached out to 520 decision makers across the ecosystem. And we certainly targeted a wide range of organizations in terms of their size. So basically, it's medium-sized organizations up through large organizations were the primary targets. And the representation here is global. We had, I think, very diverse geographic distribution. As you can see on the chart here, North America provided the most inputs for our survey. However, I think we have very great representation in Latin America, as indicated by Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and certainly also in terms of Asia with Japan and India, providing, I would say, very valuable insights, as well as naturally EMEA. And with this, I would like to emphasize that this is the first iteration of the survey. So this is something that we'll be updating every 6 months. So we will have a benchmark as to how the industry is evolving in this very vital area. More importantly, our information is public, available. Anybody can go to our website and look at it and download it and use it as needed. And this is something that we adopted to align really with the LLM era, to make sure that people can access our information. So there's no paywall, no email registration requirement, and so forth. And so we're excited about that. And specifically, this will be coming out later in June 26, basically later this month. So what I'm sharing here is a preview of the nuggets from our survey. And with that, I'll turn to the next slide. And as I promised, why does infrastructure and operation trends matter so much to the fiber ecosystem, especially during this AI epoch? Well, I would say, first of all, I think we definitely had a key takeaway from Fiber Connect, and that is that there's a shift in the traffic that must be spotlighted, and that is east-west flows within data centers are definitely expanding dramatically. So that is a contradistinction to the traditional north-south flows, which will remain important. However, when it comes to AI workflows, definitely it's going to go in this direction. So the preponderance of the bandwidth will be in this area. And so what that means is that will require the building of high capacity, middle mile, and national backbone networks to a greater degree. These have always been important, but now the spotlight will be shifting to this part of the network increasingly. Now, this augments and complements the fiber access builds that are ongoing. And Gary did a great job of updating us on what's going on with the funding. And so what's important here is that AI is going to play a key part in making these builds smarter, quite simply. I think that was something that came up in the conversations. When it comes to the access network, I think the access bandwidth will be there for inferencing and so forth at the edge. But the next thing that I would say is even more critical is how can AI make this just work better, quite simply? And that includes better precision planning and predictive deployment alongside using the edge AI within a low latency architecture to quite simply enable better outcomes for the fiber builders, for the fiber operators, but really for the customers who are receiving the service. I think the next item is pretty well understood. This is going to require extreme bandwidth across the ecosystem, and that entails 1.6T upgrade cycles. Now, they're not really commercially out yet, but what we're seeing already is that the I&O teams are ready to deploy these high-density patching, silicon photonic, and 800 gig to 1.6T upgrades to ensure that the optical pipelines will not be a choke point for AI workloads. And that is certainly important on the training side, where the GPU clusters are in the data centers that we're hearing all about in the headlines and so forth. But also, this will be impactful really across the entire implementation. And this is why fiber is going to be so integral to the success of AI overall. And I think that ties in logically to the next point, and that is there's a critical premium on ultra low latency. And so what we are seeing is that fiber operators need to deploy this advanced architectural solution, and that includes hollow core fiber alongside optical circuit switching, or OCS, to minimize signal delay. So we've already seen some big companies, including the hyperscalers such as Microsoft, invest in this area already, but we're anticipating yet more investment in this segment. And so this is something that will continue to drive, I&O decision making as they look to optimize their fiber deployments. And certainly data center geographic expansion into new areas is something that I think we are all familiar with, something that is, again, generating those headlines. And I think what's going to be important here is that the new data center builds are going increasingly into rural communities and secondary markets. And what that means is that this is an opportunity for fiber providers to understand why I&O site selection metrics can help build out that infrastructure in a way where the power and land availability are optimized. And I think this is just, part of that continuum as to, why AI and why the fiber community must come together. I think we're already seeing that there's been some community pushback already against, data center builds. However, what I think is going to help the overall market is better understanding as to why data centers aren't a zero-sum proposition in terms of a build. They can add jobs, but also they are employing very cutting-edge power efficiency capabilities. And also, when it comes to water consumption, have already proven basically a net zero outcome, i.e. it's not going to cause water metrics to disrupt, a community, a neighborhood, and so forth. But this is all tied in together. And I think that's an important foundation for understanding really the takeaways from our survey. And I think to really get more into the details of our survey, that providing a reality check is always important. And so what we're seeing here is that when it comes to I&O teams, that they are definitely at the pragmatic investment stage. In other words, the organizations out there, when they're implementing their AI workloads, that we are past, the tire kicking stage at a critical mass level, that we're no longer, so much involved in experimentation. That's still ongoing. But I think what's important here is that the vast majority of organizations that we surveyed are already committed to making AI integral to their overall I&O implementation, as a result, their overall IT planning. And so that includes the fact that not only are there's the biggest segment is at the pragmatic stage, but also that the other 30% out there include the innovators and early adopters. So that means they have pulled the trigger, that they are going to go down this path until they see the positive outcomes that we touched on. So that then asks the question, what about the remaining 30%? And so what we came away with is that, there are late adopters. They're still doing a wait and see, 18%, and 10% that are characterized as laggards. However, I'm anticipating that when we come out with our next iteration of the survey 6 months from now, that number will shrink even more. So definitely AI is going to be part of the investment cycles. It will be a strategic commitment. The CXOs are backing it. And I think we're going to see actually more ROI benefits coming out of this, as well as the improved business outcomes. And I'll be touching on that in a bit. Now, I think what's also important is the impact of AI on IT budgets and the innovation cycle. And so this is part of that reality check, that there is still an ongoing infrastructure readiness gap. And this is where I think fiber can actually play a vital role, certainly inside data centers, but also outside of data centers. And so while there's a strategic commitment, the costs have actually still exceeded what the initial expectations were. And so what this can actually mean is that some of the earlier adopters could be dialing back some of their investment, but it will be ongoing. So there will be net new investment going on in terms of AI across all the organizations. And so while the initial expenses have been more than anticipated, I think that what we'll see is more adjustments, more knowledge about, okay, how can we invest in AI and actually have better expectations and have a more realistic guidelines as to how the investment will be warranted. And I think the other important thing here is that over a third agree that their systems are not optimized or really designed to support AI-related regulations and data privacy controls. Now, this is something that I think came out more in the EMEA region, and I think we understand why, that they have more high threshold requirements for privacy on the one hand, but also I think they're further ahead with AI-specific regulations. But this is going to apply across all the regions increasingly. And so I think this is where the fiber community can actually step up and say, hey, we could be a trusted advisor with this. As Gary pointed out, the fiber community has had a lot of experience in terms of, say, BEAD requirements and BABA requirements. And so by cutting your teeth on this, I think this will be a valuable way to help organizations as they're like, okay, how can we best handle emerging AI regulations? And so I think this is really another opportunity for the fiber community to be a trusted advisor to organizations out there. Now, next is, okay, what about the regulatory compliance? And that was something that we included because when we asked, what do people want to know more about? This was at the top of the list, the top part of the list. So I already touched on the EMEA region, but I think it's also important to spotlight that the highest level of preparation for the EU AI Act is with only a third of people having full compliance at this stage. So again, there's going to be at least a pretty good majority that are going to need to come up to speed. So anybody targeting that region needs to keep this in mind as to how you could be a better partner for your customers. Also, I think what is important is that while a third of the organizations feel fully prepared for sector-specific rules, and certainly healthcare and insurance came out, but also it's about preparing for U.S. federal policy specifically. That is the Trump administration's 2025 EO executive order. And so again, there's some trailing here, but we're anticipating that people definitely have it high on their priority list and that they will definitely, I think, make great progress in this area over the rest of 26. So again, when we update the survey, I think we're going to see more higher levels of readiness, and that will be good news. But it's important to know that today, this is something that's driving the decision-making out there, and this is something that needs to be addressed. Now, naturally, okay, what about other factors that aren't necessarily related to, say, the government and regulatory side? And that is deploying and scaling IT infrastructure. In other words, speeds and feeds still matter, but it's also really about how can we make the fiber network more intelligent. That I think is very key here. And so, but what about the breakdown about, okay, being able to deploy and scale IT infrastructure for I&O capabilities? And I think what we see is something that is not terribly unique to AI, but it's definitely in play. And that is 72% identified security and compliance as the key challenge, or it's the topmost challenge. And so, again, I think people just need that peace of mind. The decision makers need the assurances that, okay, as we implement AI, that the security will be built in. There won't be, say, unpleasant surprises as, for example, they enable LLMs that are customized for the organizations to drive, more of the workflows. But then there's that next step. What about agentic capabilities and agentic operations? And this is where I think it's very important for the fiber community to say, okay, this is something that we are fully aligned with. Certainly, when it came to the Fiber Connect, there were great conversations with players such as Cisco and Nokia that are helping to prepare for this. And so this is going to be very vital to the success of how I&O teams are going to implement certainly their AI implementations, but also incorporate fiber as a part of that. And so I think this is where the next bullet is going to be very helpful. That is 60% rated cost management and optimization as an ongoing key challenge. So what this means is, please help us. We want to work with our suppliers and with our strategic partners to make sure that we get this right and not have costs be an unpleasant surprise ongoing. So already the costs were higher than expected, but now how can we right this ship more, because we are fully committed to optimizing AI workloads across our entire fiber implementations. And that's why I&O is so critical to make sure that happens. And so that, I think, comes out in our next slide, is that when it comes to organizations and how they're going to scale their AI workloads, virtualization will be integral, quite simply. And so over half of the organizations that we surveyed indicated that they're going to increase their virtualization investments. And I think that's aligning with, okay, how can we help keep the AI costs, better in line? And so another third is we're not going to change anything. At least that's what they're projecting right now. So in other words, all this investment is already committed, or it will keep increasing. So it's a good bet that this will locked in. And only 16% have indicated reduced spending in this particular area. And so that's fine. However, I think that number will probably decrease even more when we update the survey. And so, why is this so important for the fiber community? Well, quite simply, the virtualization aspect is going to play a vital role for the dynamic abstraction, plus the programming, as well as scaling the bandwidth across the physical fiber access plant, and well, certainly the access point. So it's all about how can we make it smarter? How can we make the fiber deployments more intelligent so that the AI capabilities, alongside all the other strategically important workloads, are going to basically meet the customer demands while adding more value. And so again, we're seeing the virtualization playing a key role in how, for example, the hyperscalers, but any organization out there that's using a customized language model in order to make it work for them. And that ties into the next slide, and that is Kubernetes rising. And that is, okay, why did I include this slide? Well, quite simply, it's all about developers out there when it comes to the enterprises and organizations that want to make sure that they get their true bang for the buck from their AI investments. And so at the top of this chart is that 30% cited as their key motivator that the adoption of Kubernetes is important to make sure that the developers stay committed to the workloads that they want to optimize, as well as quite simply streamlining the CI/CD processes. So I think this is something that has come out already in talking with the data center builds out there, certainly the ones that are investing heavily in it, for example, the hyperscalers, but also the neo cloud players, but also very importantly, the enterprises that are now investing in their specific private data center upgrades to make sure that they aren't going to be left behind on the one hand, but again, to optimize the inferencing at the edge. And so I think what the key takeaway here is that when it comes to Kubernetes, the key role here is about, again, enabling the containerization and the dynamic scaling of VNFs to make sure that the edge is ready to handle these AI workload shifts. And again, nobody will get left behind as a result. And so, yeah, that is, I think, the key takeaways from the survey we conducted and why it's so important to the fiber community. And so to reiterate, infrastructure and operations is very, I would say, integral to driving pragmatic AI investment. That is, in order to make sure that the AI investments align better, that the I&O teams are finding better ways to make that happen. And again, it's all about the budgeting. Again, the direct impact is here. Our survey certainly improved it. But what's, I think, important is that despite some of the, I would say, early price concerns, that the commitment will be ongoing through the rest of this year, and I would say certainly into 27 and beyond. Another thing, though, that I think that doesn't get enough, I would say, spotlighting, but it's actually driving the decision-making out there is, can we make sure that we are up to speed on the AI regulations out there? And that includes really, certainly all the key regions. Certainly, I would say the EMEA region is probably furthest along in making sure that the organizations out there uphold these AI rules. But I would say the US, North America aren't far behind, as well as Latin America and Asia Pacific. Certainly, security and cost management are always going to be important, but this definitely verifies it, and that this is something that when you're talking with partners, when you're talking with customers, that this is something that is addressed at the very front end. address the fact, like, yes, the workloads are going through an evolution. So east-west traffic, it will definitely be more important, and thus, the I/O decision making will be aligned with that. This will help, again, fuel the fiber access growth potentiality out there, because it will be needed certainly on the business side, the enterprise side, to make the network smarter, quite simply. And when it comes to the data centers and the scale out scenarios and so forth, fiber will be obviously vital to the bandwidth and 1.6T upgrades out there. Certainly, one headline is the NVIDIA Corning alliance. That multi-billion-dollar deal underlines why the fiber community is going to be so critically important to the success of the AI builds out there. And the numbers speak for themselves. For example, NVIDIA has already committed $500 million, that is $500 million, to direct investment in Corning that can go all the way up to $3.2 billion alongside the multi-billion-dollar deal out there. So I think this underlines, why the fiber and AI communities are going to be so strategically aligned into the foreseeable future. And that, I think, aligns along with many of the other important ones out there. Certainly NVIDIA and Nokia comes to mind. Delivering that ultra low latency is just going to require more fiber connectivity. And of course, I think we all understand data center expansion. Now, I think the important thing is to teach the communities out there, to help outreach that, okay, a data center build is not a bad thing for a community. It can very much be a net positive, but there just has to be better information out there. And I think this is something that this survey can help relay. And with that, thank you, Gary, for the opportunity to share these results and talk fiber and AI.
Well, certainly, just as we talked about at our conference a couple weeks ago, is, we're in this super cycle investment. We saw this big investment for fiber to the home coming out of COVID, and now layered on top of that is our, AI infrastructure investment and quantum networking and so forth. So this is creating this massive opportunity. Given the geographic diversity of your survey was very, very diverse, other than regulation, what regional differences did you see?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that when it comes to some of the AI infrastructure investment, we're seeing more of it in the US. And I think that stands to reason. The major hyperscalers are primarily based in the US. Some of the earlier investment on the enterprise side, and this I think came out, for example, in the Cisco quarterly numbers, is that the US is at the forefront when you're talking about, okay, where is the play at on a geographic basis. Now, that does not deny, okay, there are very important emerging opportunities. And I think what's important to understand about the EU is that by aligning with those regulations, that I think once that is taken care of, that will spur more investment in the EMEA region as a result. And I think when we update the survey 6 months from now, that will come out more so that there won't be so much investment concentration in the US, but it will be more, I would say, evenly spread out. So I think that's definitely something important to keep an eye on.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I was in London in April, the ISPs were heads down on, here are the deployment issues we have with fiber to the home, and kind of getting down to the last locations, and never one mentioned data centers or AI. And then there were sessions on AI, but it was kind of separate, where definitely in the US, I don't think there's an ISP out there that's not trying to figure out how they're participating in this super cycle. Can you explain? So one of the things I think is really important, what you said, is the shift from east-west traffic, or from north-south, kind of the way we've been living, to now east-west and north-south. Can you explain what all that means and what the significance of that is?
Yes, I would say it pertains certainly to data centers, but I would say, across networking implementations. And that is certainly when it comes to fiber connectivity, the design over the years, as we know, has been, for example, when it comes to a business or a residence, that the traffic was primarily downstream to the customer, and there wasn't so much upstream traffic. Now, we saw some shifting of that recently because of more interactivity capabilities, for example, in the video gaming community and so forth. But what I think is going to be even more dramatic is that because of the expansion of east-west traffic, which is required for optimizing AI workloads wherever they are, for example, the GPU clusters within data centers, that traffic has to be optimized on an east-west basis, that is between the data centers, in order to make sure that the training is delivering what is needed. That is, reducing hallucinations on one hand, but certainly, ensuring that the data sets are going to be ready for prime time as enterprises invest increasingly in this capability. But I think it's also underlining the fact that when it comes to AI inferencing, that there will be more activity at the edge, and that includes really everything that's not the data center core. And so as a result, the east-west traffic, say, within an enterprise is definitely going to increase as a result because of AI workloads specifically. And so this is something that the I&O teams are definitely prioritizing, planning for, and this is where, again, the super cycle investment cycle is going to be increasingly supporting that type of traffic. And as a result, the community really needs to be making sure to be prepared for it, but also it's creating certainly market opportunity. And I think that's why we're seeing, for example, these strategic alliances that we touched on to make sure that the east-west traffic is not going to be a bottleneck, and that certainly the fiber connections within data centers are going to be ready for just that, for AI's, next level of capabilities.
Well said, Ron. And I think that's the thing we saw with the Open Vault data out the fourth quarter. Certainly saw that Jeff Hanen's report on his studies last week. So we are seeing this huge surge in demand on upstream, and being able to build out lower latency, more robust networks to be able to serve this whole east-west, and then inference certainly is getting all the way to, in some cases, to the basement of your house when NVIDIA drops in GPU racks. So it's a crazy world. But Ron, really appreciate it. Thanks for the timeliness of this report. This study couldn't be more pertinent and relevant to what's happening right now with this super cycle investment in AI and access infrastructure. So thank you for that. And I thank everybody for joining us. Look forward to getting back together next Wednesday with another good friend of ours, Eric Keith, Senior Research Analyst for Broadband Infrastructure at S&P Global, to discuss fiber technology trends, key takeaways from S&P Global's annual telecom operators survey. So you're not going to want to miss that. So thanks again, Ron. Thanks, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you guys next week.